Good morning, everybody. This is Noreen Jalloway Gill with UNTY's University of North Texas Workplace Inclusion and Sustainable Employment. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon as we're going to be spending the next hour learning about basic skills needed for supported decision making, and those ideas and how we can also support the people that we help finding employment and living in the community so that they're able to fully participate. So you should have, all of our participants, if you would go to our control panel, you should be able to look down in that control panel and see, amongst other things, the question box. If you could go to that question box, and everybody that's already in the webinar, if you could sign in. And I'd like for you to sign in with your name and then also what you do. If you're a community rehabilitation provider, a teacher, an employment specialist, a therapist, kind of what role you play, and perhaps even if you want to, what you hope to learn today in our session talking about supported decision making. We have as our speaker today Jeff Miller, who is with Disability Rights of Texas. And Jeff has put together a PowerPoint presentation that you should find in your handout section of that control panel. If you should have also received it when we gave you a confirmation email. But in case you don't have it in front of you, you should have a PDF version of that there in the control panel. And you will also see a second document that's going to be a form that is a part of the presentation that Jeff will discuss as a part of his, as he moves through and talks to us about what's available for us and learning about supported decision making. So I see several people have signed on. I'm hoping that a few more people, we have some employment consultants, and a provider, a graduate student at UNT working on rehabilitation services, master's in rehabilitation. So super glad to have you guys joining us. I hope I see a few more people sign on. Just to remind you guys that this is how we know that you're on and listening, and also to send you the evaluation form after the session is over. So I want to see your names up there. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. If you can't, please call and talk with Deborah at UNT. I actually don't call, send her an email at untwise@unt.edu, and that way if you have to problem solve, she can help you with that. She's our technical support person. So we only have 60 minutes. There's a lot of information to cover. Just a little bit about Jeff. Jeff Miller works at Disability Rights of Texas. He is a policy specialist, works on both voting rights and support decision making for people with disabilities. I know Jeff through many years of his work with both Disability Rights of Texas as well as when he just worked with the ARC of Texas, and so he's really been helpful in understanding a lot of education rules and regulations, transition age and youth, and them entering into the adult world of services, also protecting rights and as they move through community supports and services. He also shares his personal experience as a father of a son with who has disabilities. So Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for sharing this information about supported decision making. It really is, so decision making is an important piece of the entire employment process. So I think that knowing that this is going to be that this is now available in Texas, that there's actually a process in place, it's going to be a valuable tool for our employment specialists. So we're looking forward to seeing what you have to share.
Well, thank you, Noreen, and thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. Today we're going to talk about sort of a new concept, but an old concept, and that's the idea of supported decision making. And we're going to talk specifically about what that means both legally in Texas and then as a concept and where that came from, and then talk a little bit about how the concepts that go into supported decision making that are now in use in Texas are also going to be really important for us to understand as we think about employment of people with disabilities and how this can help them as they seek to have a real life with a real job in a real community. So when we think about supported decision-making in Texas, the first place we have to start is by talking about guardianship, because supported decision-making in Texas came about as a new law directly as a response to the guardianship process in Texas. And so about 3.5 years ago, a group of attorneys and parents and advocates and judges and other legal folks got together and started discussing the guardianship process. And there was real concern that the guardianship process in Texas, number one, didn't work very well for individuals and families. But more importantly, there was a real concern that the number of guardianships in Texas had been growing over a number of years, and that people were seeing a lot of individuals, specifically individuals with disabilities, that were being appointed guardians that may or may not have really needed that level of support, that possibly there could have been some other alternative to guardianship for that individual so that they didn't lose their rights. And so when we talk about guardianship and why we might want to look at alternatives first, there's some of the things that this group talked about and ultimately led to a reform in the laws in Texas. First of all, guardianship involves a court. And so there's court oversight from the beginning because that's where the guardianship starts. The judge determines whether or not there should be a guardian appointed, and then as long as the guardian serves, there's oversight by the court in that process. And because it's a formal legal process, that means that it involves attorneys. And if attorneys are involved, that means it can be expensive. So that's one of the issues with guardianship. But probably the most important thing from our standpoint is that guardianship is that legal process where a judge can determine that an individual does not have the right to make decisions about their own lives, and gives that authority and ability to a third person to make decisions about the life of an individual with a disability. And because that process is taking away someone's individual choices and self-determination and independence, we thought that we really needed to look as a state at the process of guardianship and figure out if there's a way that we could try to safeguard the process of an individual having the right to make their own decisions in cases where some lesser alternatives could be involved. And so with the use of a lot of people working together really hard, we were able to get some reforms passed by the last Texas legislature, and that's directly where this idea of supported decision-making and supported decision-making agreements come from. Just as we get started here, a couple of things that I always like to point out. Number one, Texas law presumes that every adult has the capacity or the ability to make their own decisions, and that includes everyone, even people with disabilities. So in our state, in our process, the only person that can determine that an individual doesn't have the ability to make their own decisions is a judge in a guardianship proceeding. So unless and until that happens, an individual with a disability is their own guardian and legally has the right to make their own decisions. Even if they have a family member that continues to want to make decisions for that individual, or a provider or some other person that has concern that maybe an individual isn't able to make good decisions, until and unless there's a legal process started, that individual has the right to make their own decisions. So what we at Disability Rights Texas and we, the greater community, need to do is figure out in those kinds of situations where there are concerns, what kind of support does that individual need in order to make the best decisions they can make for their own lives. Another thing that I think it's really important to always remember is that decision making is a learned skill. The more we make decisions, the more we learn how to make decisions. And that's both good decisions and bad decisions. Most of us start this process when we're young, and so over time we learn from the decisions that we make. When things go well, we learn that that was probably a pretty good decision. When they don't go things don't go so well, then we learn from that as well. It's important to remember that oftentimes with people with disabilities, specifically people with lots of support needs, when they're younger aren't given a whole lot of opportunities to make decisions, because as family members and as educators and providers and people involved with them, we want to make sure that they're safe, and we want to make sure that things happen that need to happen. And so the kinds of decisions that people are allowed to make are a lot fewer, and so people don't learn how to make those well-informed decisions. And then finally, there really are some legal alternatives to the guardianship process that in lots of cases can be used instead of taking away someone's rights to make decisions about their own lives under guardianship. And those are things like powers of attorney and the supported decision-making agreement, which we'll talk more about in a minute, and things like using a representative payee to help with financial situations. So what is supported decision-making? The whole concept of supported decision-making has been around for a really long time. It became more of an academic exercise and things that people started talking about in the disability world about 10 years ago or so, and started being used and talked about in Europe, and then in Canada, and finally migrated to the United States. And it's basically the idea of, it's an alternative to guardianship that allows an individual with a disability to have their friends and family members and professionals help them understand situations and choices and make their own decisions without the need for a guardian. And so academically, that's the definition. The Texas legislature defines supported decision-making as a process of supporting and accommodating an adult with a disability to make those life decisions, and specifically decisions about where they want to live, service and supports and medical care that they want to receive, who they want to live with, and decisions about where they want to work and how they want to work. And through this process, continuing to have the ability to make determinations about their own life and the things that they want. So essentially, supported decision-making is when an individual who needs to make a decision asks somebody else to help them figure out what the decision is they want to make and what their options are, and then after they make a decision, make sure other people understand the decision that was made. So, for instance, this is something that a lot of us, I think, can really relate to, because I know that when I have to make major decisions, I'm going to buy a car, or I have a car that needs to be repaired, or that sort of thing, I can talk to the mechanic and I can find out what they recommend and what the estimate is, but I'm probably going to get on the phone and call my brother, who knows a whole lot more about cars than I do, and see what he thinks and get his opinion. Now, ultimately, it's my decision to make about what to do about my car, but I'm going to get information from other people, and I think we all do that to some degree or another, and so that's just the way that we do things. And we have now legally called that supported decision-making in Texas. So why is supported decision-making important? Well, it's important because supported decision-making as a concept is really all about opportunities. It's about giving people with intellectual disability and developmental disabilities more opportunities to make more choices, and therefore they're better able to make decisions. Because as we talked about earlier, remember, decision-making is a learned skill. So the more we practice it, the better we get at it. And so that's the whole point behind supported decision-making, is to find ways to give individuals more opportunities to make those choices so that over time they improve the ability to make decisions about their lives.
So Jeff, one of the comments that did come through has to do with supported decision making and how the law, if the law actually is specifically for a certain group of people with disabilities, or if it applies to all people with disabilities. And in that last slide, it indicated people with intellectual disabilities. I know that part of working with people with psychiatric disabilities, that the guardianship also is sometimes a barrier for people having choice or being able to make decisions or having choices. So is the law applied to all populations? Or is it specific?
Basically, the law says that any adult, so anyone 18 or older that has a disability, and that's defined as a mental or physical impairment that substantially impacts a major life activity. So it could be someone with an intellectual or a developmental disability. It could be someone with a psychological issue, or it could be someone. So it's not limited to one diagnosis or one group of people.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think when we're talking about supported decision making, the whole concept behind this idea that people need to be given more opportunities to make more choices is all based on the concept of self-determination. And self-determination has a lot to do with having control over a person's life. And so having the ability and the opportunity to be a causal agent or being an actor in your own life instead of being acted upon, which is the major difference between the concept of something like a supported decision-making agreement, which we'll talk more about in a minute, and having a guardian is that whole idea of who gets to make the decision, who's in control. And with guardianship, people give up control, and there are things that happen as a result of that. And with supported decision-making, some things happen as well, and most of those are more positive. And so it's all based on this concept of self-determination. So just to spell it out, self-determination is about making choices and learning how to solve problems. And so when people have control over their life, and then they can learn to take responsibility for their lives. So that's what self-determination has to do with. And practicing self-determination also means that one gets to experience the consequences of making choices. And so like we talked about a little bit earlier, most of us have those experiences of making good decisions and not so good decisions. But unfortunately, in lots of situations, some people with disabilities aren't put in a position where they're able to make decisions that those around them would disagree with. Sometimes in wanting to protect people because they have a label, we don't allow them to make mistakes. And so it's that idea of dignity of risk, that we value people's lives enough to allow them to make choices that we might disagree with, because that's how people learn, number one. And number two, as an adult that doesn't have a guardian that's in charge of their lives, they have the right to make those decisions. So research shows us that there are some definite benefits of people that are able to practice self-determination. And so research shows us that people are healthier, people are more independent, well-adjusted, they're able to recognize abuse and those sorts of things. And none of this, I mean, this is pretty straightforward stuff, but I think it's always good to see that there have been studies and this really is borne out. Likewise, the research shows that there are some negative effects of people that aren't allowed to practice self-determination in their lives. And so people can feel helpless and hopeless and self-critical and have low self-esteem and feel inadequate and incompetent. And if you think about it, I mean, when people don't feel like they have any control over their own lives, these are the kinds of responses that you would expect. So, how does supported decision-making and self-determination work together? And they create this potential to increase, let me start over. Supported decision-making as a model has the potential to increase the self-determination of people that are using a supported decision-making agreement. It encourages and it empowers people because they have more control of their own lives, and it also can foster that independence of an individual and help them integrate more fully in their communities. And then also research has shown that people that practice self-determination are more likely to be employed. So we see this direct link between the idea of self-determination or supported decision-making and employment outcomes for people with disabilities.
You know, Jeff, I went to the Texas Advocates Conference, I guess it was the first part of this month, that was there in San Marcos, and it's a statewide conference of people with intellectual developmental disabilities and people with autism, and about 450 self-advocates there, and we had this little side session where we talked about self-determination and asked people to just define what that meant to them, and with very few exceptions in the list of how people described self-determination, they talked about two things. One was freedom, and the other one was having a job and making money. So, so that idea of self-determination, or the idea of employment, and having a job and making money and having access to money, it increased their options for freedom and actually to practice some self-determination. What is it that they want to do and how they spend their money? So it's kind of very circular. It all builds on each other, it seems like. But that self-determination is kind of one of those lingo kind of words that can get really lost unless we understand that there are some basic guiding principles behind it, and decision-making being one of the primary ones, that person having the support so that their preferences in the decision-making are heard and created. So I just thought I'd share that with you.
No, thank you. I think that's exactly right. I think that, first of all, it makes perfect sense that if you want to have control over your life and be free to make decisions, you have to have money to do that. And so a lot of people figure out that having a real job, earning a real income can really help us all have more opportunities to make decisions about the kind of life that we want to have. And the other thing I will definitely agree with, I think sometimes we can really complicate things by overanalyzing concepts like self-determination or supported decision-making, when really it's just a matter of people feeling like they and having control of their own lives and being able to make their own decisions, and with supported decision-making, having the freedom and the trust in someone else to assist you in making those decisions.
Absolutely.
So once again, this isn't real difficult, but it never hurts to state the obvious. We see from research and just experience that you have people with similar abilities and support needs, that people without guardians are practice more self-determination in their lives than people that have guardians. And that people that don't have guardians are much more likely to live independently and have their own friends and other than family and staff, and to socialize and to have a paid job. So the concept of supported decision making is that idea of someone asking someone else to help them make a decision. Like I talked about earlier, in Texas we actually took that informal concept and made it much more formal by passing a law. And Texas was the first state in the country to recognize supported decision making in the form of a supported decision making agreement, which is the form that we'll talk about in just a minute. Texas officially recognizes that as an alternative to guardianship. And so Texas was first. So in the supported decision-making agreement form, you can see here, is really very straightforward. It's not a real complicated form, although it was written by attorneys, and so some of it is sort of attorney-like in that manner. But this is a form that was developed by Disability Rights Texas and some folks that we work with. When the law was passed, there's actually a form, an example in the law itself that can be used, and the law basically says that any form that is substantially similar to the one that's listed in the statute can be used. And so you can see that this form basically identifies the individual with a disability, the person that they've chosen to support them, and their information, and then the individual with a disability gets to decide what are the issues that they want the person that they've asked to support them, what areas do they want them to help them with. And you can see there's basically a list of areas there that can be checked, and then there's a place that they can add other things if there's other issues they want support with. And with a supported decision-making agreement, a person with a disability can have one supporter that helps them potentially with all of these things, or they could potentially have a different supporter, a different friend, a different family member help them with different areas. So someone may be helping them deal with their physical and mental health, and then somebody else helping them deal with decisions that deal with managing money or property. And so that's listed. Then there's a place on the form where it talks about having access to confidential information. And so that is checked. And because confidential information, there are some federal laws that deal with the privacy rights for health records and privacy rights dealing with educational records. Oftentimes when we are helping somebody execute a supported decision-making agreement, we will also help them execute a release of information so that the supporter can help the individual with a disability collect records and information in order to make decisions about those things. Then you can see that on the back side of this agreement, there's a place to name the supporter, and then the form is either witnessed by two individuals that are over 14, or is witnessed by a notary public, and then it becomes an enforceable document. The form also points out that there is an obligation for anyone that has reason to believe that a supporter is abusing, neglecting, or exploiting the individual with a disability, that there's an obligation to report that to Adult Protective Services, through the Department of Family and Protective Services, and the numbers actually listed on the form. And then there's also a statement to remind third parties that as long as they honor a supported decision-making agreement in good faith, that there is no potential criminal or civil liability, that people in good faith can rely on either the document itself or a copy of it. So just quickly, who can enter a supported decision-making agreement? And we sort of talked about this before. So any individual with a physical or mental disability that substantially limits a major life activity. And so the other big question that's often asked about supported decision-making is what is the capacity that is required by someone to enter into this kind of agreement or relationship with another person? Well, the statute doesn't deal with that. It does not specifically say what level of capacity a person has to have. But a person has to be able to understand that they're asking someone to help them, that they have decisions to make, understand what the potential choices may be, and be able to communicate with their supporter the kinds of decisions that they're making. So in terms of who can actually be a supporter of an individual with a disability in a supported decision-making agreement, the law doesn't put any restrictions on who can be a supporter, but typically a supporter would be someone that the individual with a disability knows and they trust and they're able to communicate with. And oftentimes that'll be a family member or another relative or a friend. But it could be a former teacher or a former service provider or those kinds of things. So it's broad because it was intended to be as flexible as it's needed for an individual, because the whole point here is that the person with a disability gets to decide who they want to support them and in what role. So what are the kinds of things that supporters do in a supported decision-making relationship or a supported decision-making agreement? Typically, they assist the adult with a disability in understanding their options and responsibilities and the consequences of the decisions that they're trying to make. They're able to help the individual with a disability to collect and obtain different kinds of records or information. Then they can help them understand what that information may mean. And then finally, once a decision's made, the supporter can help the individual with a disability to communicate that decision to others, to help them understand what decision was made and how that decision was reached. So a question that often is asked is, how is a supported decision-making agreement different than a power of attorney? In a power of attorney situation, an individual executes an agreement, a document, that gives another person the ability to do things on their behalf. So they specifically give the authority or power to somebody else to act as their agent. And so once they have this power of attorney, the person that's acting as my agent could access my bank account, could sell my property, could do different things for me, but they can decide what they do and how to do them. In supported decision making, no one can act on my behalf unless I'm there as well. So it's all about who ultimately has the authority to act in a situation. And so with a power of attorney, the agent or the person I've given my power of attorney to can independently make decisions to act. Now, they're supposed to be acting in my best interest, but they independently have the authority to make decisions for me. With a supported decision-making agreement, only I can make decisions. My supporter can help me make those decisions, but ultimately I have to make all those decisions myself. Hopefully that makes sense. So, what does employment have to do with guardianship and supported decision-making? And it all comes back to this idea of self-determination in the control of a person's own life. Because as we noted before, that people that are able to practice self-determination are more independent, they're more integrated into their community, they're healthier, and they're better employed and make more money. And a lot of that, I think, goes back to what you talked about earlier, Noreen, is as people are able to experience freedom and want that in their lives, they see that working and earning money is a big part of that and allows them to exercise more freedom and to be more in control of their own lives. So when we think about employment and helping individuals with disabilities find a job and actually be successful, it all starts with a plan. But for plans to succeed, they've got to be the right kind of plans. That's why I think it's really important to think about the fact that the IPE has to be based on those concepts of self-determination that we talked about earlier. It's got to be based on the goals and the desires and the wants of the individual with a disability, not just what might work. And so the idea is to help an individual get the job that they want to have. And so that kind of job that's designed to help them, or that fits their skills and their interests and their choices. And so when we talk about choices and think about employment, we are reminded of this idea of informed choice. And so the regulations that deal with vocational rehabilitation programs talk about that one of the purposes of vocational rehabilitation is to inform applicants and individuals about the availability and opportunities to exercise informed choice, including the availability of support services for individuals with disabilities who require assistance in exercising that informed choice. So if we think about this in terms of one of the purposes for VR or one of the roles of VR in this whole process is helping people figure out what their choices are going to be and then support them and provide the kind of support that they need in order to make a real choice or an informed choice. To me, that sounds a whole lot like the supported decision-making concepts we talked about based on self-determination, that the individual with a disability is the person that gets to make the choices, but that we could have a role in supporting them and helping them make the best choice that they can make for them. And so it all comes down to the idea that an informed choice has to be a real choice. It's got to be a choice that an individual gets to make for themselves. And so it's not choice if there's only one option. So if we think about helping a person make a decision about the kind of job that they want to have, and their only choice is the person that's got the help wanted sign in their window, yes, that may be a way to get somebody a job, but is that really an informed choice that the individual with a disability is making? And so it can't be based on what we think is an easy job or an available job, or it can't be choices based on the wants and desires of family members or providers, or choices that are made because we're concerned about transportation or other things, or that an individual need a whole lot more preparation and acquiring a lot more different kinds of skills or other things first before they could pursue the job that they want. If we really believe in the idea of self-determination and supported decision-making, helping an individual make the kinds of choices that they really want to make, then we've got to believe that we have to look at what a person really wants and then help them figure out what needs to happen in order to make the decision or the choice that they have opted for to make that a reality. So one of the ways that that happens is the idea of the discovery process and using that to help someone that's that has a disability or some significant support challenges to help them figure out what is the best choice possible for them, what are the kinds of things that need to be done. And so because the idea of the discovery uses more qualitative, informal measures in natural settings, it's often a better way to look at really an individual's own strengths, desires, choices, and that sort of thing, and getting a better idea of what's going to need to happen in order to fulfill their employment-related goals. And the other thing to remember about the discovery process is because it is person-centered, so it's going to use these ideas of self-determination to look at an individual themselves. And so, you know, looking at those interests and talents and the kinds of environments they want to be in and the activities that they want to be involved in, and looking at their current skills, and then coming up with those ideas of what other skills might they need, what are the best environments, and all those sorts of things.
So Jeff, one of the questions that came up, and it goes actually back to the form that you presented earlier, and it might help though with this discussion as well, is as providers, does the provider become the supported decision maker, or is it a person in the natural circle of support for the employment decisions? I guess kind of clarifying around that was one of the questions,
Sure.
although they kind of answered it themselves. And then I guess the other question would be, is that a form that an employment specialist would look for or ask for as they're going through the discovery process?
Well, I think the answer to the first question is it could be either. An individual could ask an employment specialist to be their supporter and function in that role, although I think that there's some potential conflicts of interest there. And that would be something for the law would say that a paid employee could be a supporter because there's nothing in the supported decision-making law that would prohibit that. A person's employer may have a policy that says that someone that is assigned a client may not function in another role with that client outside of work or whatever. So that would be something to look at. I think it's probably more likely that what people are going to see is an individual with a disability show up with someone supporting them and working with the employment specialist to help that individual with a disability understand what's being asked and what the decisions are that they have to make and that sort of thing. So I hope that answered the question.
And they'll let us know if it didn't. So the other comment that came in is that many transition age youth are considered for guardianship.
Yes.
Is that something that you've experienced? Okay, that seems to be the critical age at which a lot of people start to pursue a guardianship proceedings, and are
the
they
federal law,
they can find out?
the federal special education law says that when a student in special education turns 18, the parental rights, the rights of the parents to make educational decisions transfer to now the adult student with a disability. The only time that that would not happen under state law, it specifically mentions that this transfer of rights happens unless the student is under a guardianship. And unfortunately, in lots of places, school personnel, probably in many cases through no fault of their own other than they're not aware of other alternatives, tell parents when a student turns 17, informs them that when the student, the following year on their birthday when they turn 18, that the parent rights go to the student and the parent will no longer be able to be involved in the student's educational decision making. That's not true. There really are alternatives to guardianship that could be put in place that are much less restrictive than guardianship. But unfortunately, lots of school personnel aren't informed about what those alternatives are, and many parents, of course, don't realize that there are alternatives. And so by one estimation currently in Texas, 51% of all new guardianships entered into every year are students in special education that have turned 18.
Wow, that's a lot, 51%. Okay.
Oh, and the second part of the first question I don't think I actually answered was the question of should people be asking for supported decision-making agreements or looking for them. And I think that hopefully they will become more and more common. So I think asking whether or not an individual has one would be a great idea.
Okay.
Because I think
so
that you would want to know if someone you're working with has someone that is supporting them in certain areas.
One of the other questions about guardianship was, can both guardianship and supported decision making be used at the same time with an individual?
And the answer is yes, they can. If a person has a guardian and the guardian agrees to practice supported decision making, that could work. Unfortunately, legally speaking, the guardian would still have the authority in that situation to make the ultimate decision. I could envision and hope to see that in a situation where someone has a guardian, but both the guardian and the individual with a disability are working on trying to increase the self-determination in the life of the individual with a disability, that using supported decision-making would be a way to start for the individual to make more of their own decisions, because like we talked about, decision-making is a learned process, and so then over time, the goal would be that the individual with a disability would no longer need the guardian to make the ultimate decisions, and they could terminate or rescind the guardianship.
Okay. So in that case, but guardianship will always take precedence over supported decision-making if they both exist at the same time. So we have another question, if that's okay. What if the person providing the supported decision-making does not assist the individual in the best way? I've experienced this before, is the comment behind that question.
Well, and I guess the question I would have in that situation is, what does the best way mean? If the person supporting the individual with a disability is actually exploiting the individual, then that is something that should be reported to the Department of Family and Protective Services, because that's against the law. And actually the supported decision-making agreement law specifically says that if the supporter is ever found to have a confirmed allegation of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, or ever convicted of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, then the supported decision-making agreement ends at that point. But if the question or the issue is that the support that's being given to the individual with a disability may or may not be the best, or that this kind of support that I would give or you would give, or the kinds of decisions that I would have chosen, that's ultimately up to the individual with a disability to decide if they're still happy with their relationship and still like the information that they're receiving.
Okay. Well, we got a little bit further explanation in that it said that the person providing the supported decision making, that they were exploiting the individual with a disability financially, and then later on they were awarded guardianship.
Ugh.
So, yeah, it sounds difficult at best.
Yeah. So that would definitely be a situation where if someone sensed that they were exploiting them, that it should be reported, and then after an investigation, DFPS could determine whether or not they thought that there was enough evidence to substantiate that. And but once, and actually the same is actually true of a guardian. If there's reason to believe that a person that has guardianship is neglecting or exploiting their ward, their person under guardianship, then that should be reported as well, and that could be grounds for removing the guardian and appointing somebody else.
And I think that maybe thinking about how that's reported, and then apparently in this case it was reported and it's still remained an issue. So the follow-up or what other kinds of actions could be taken may be something that could be addressed.
And one of the other things, just so people know the information, Disability Rights Texas is the state protection and advocacy organization for people with disabilities. And basically what that means is that we are a legal services agency that has attorneys and advocates that try to protect the legal and service rights of individuals with disabilities. One of the focuses that we have at Disability Rights Texas are the civil rights of individuals with disabilities. So in a situation where a person has a guardian and there's concern about the guardian's actions, and the person with a disability would like to either remove their guardian or try to recover some of their rights, that is a kind of service that Disability Rights Texas is able to offer to people with disabilities. And in those kinds of cases, if we're able to help an individual, there's no charge. So just as a resource for people to know that if they are working with someone and there's a concern about either a guardianship situation or someone that would like to learn more about how to use supported decision making in their own lives, that's something that we do at no charge to people with disabilities. So.
Well, and I know you have a few more slides, Jeff, and it's, you know, we're about 7 minutes before our end time. So, and there's looks like we have a couple more questions. So you might want to see if you can take us through the rest of this. Okay, and then we'll do the questions. So just finally, just to finish up with this idea of the discovery process, you know, it is based on those things that we've been talking about this whole time, the idea of person-centeredness and looking at the individual and what they want and what they need, looking at self-determination and people having that control over their own lives to make their own choices, and then making a real choice, the informed choice. So that's why the discovery process is important, and why it's really ties in well, I think, with this whole concept of supported decision making. And so one of the other things I think it's really important to understand and to remember is that if you're going to try to support somebody to be able to make the best choices for themselves that they can make, we've got to be prepared. So preparation is essential. So having some idea about the services that are out there, the laws that are out there, how
person-centered planning works, what guardianship is and the alternatives, I mean, those kinds of things, having some basic understanding that it's really important. So when you're working with an individual and you hear about other barriers or other issues, you at least know enough to know where to get the information that that individual might need in order to make an informed choice about their lives. Knowing about other resources and other programs, knowing that places like Disability Rights Texas exists and may be an option to help for some people in some areas. You know, as an employment specialist, you can't fix a whole family or in some cases the entire life of an individual with a disability. You know, you're focused on the employment, which is really important, but sometimes there's other things that happen as well. So just being able to give people information about other resources that may be able to help them in those other parts of their lives can sometimes be really important. And then really keeping in mind about the fact that even though sometimes it's easier to suggest to people what they should do or to steer them a particular direction, you know, the whole point of self-determination and supported decision-making is to truly allow the individual with a disability to make their own choices. And in the employment world, you know, the VR regulations are real clear. That's that whole idea of informed choice. So giving people real choices and allowing them to make those choices. So just in closing, I mean, I really think that these principles of self-determination and supported decision-making can help us help individuals with disabilities, you know, identify those kinds of jobs and match that they want to do and help them make decisions on how that matches to their skills and their interests to really help people identify those barriers and prepare for the kind of job that they want to have and then overcome any barriers that get in the way. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon, and I don't know if we have a time for those couple other questions that you had, Noreen, or not.
Sure. I think that one of them came from your comments about the employment specialists and their role, and is what if we know someone who really could use help with making with decision making, but no one has talked about the formal process.
I think that making sure that they that they're familiar with the concept of supported decision making or having someone help them make the decisions that they need to make. And if they're interested, there's resources available on our website. There are people here that are always happy to talk with individuals about what self-determination and supported decision-making can mean to them and help them go through that process if that's something that they're interested in.
Okay. And one other comment had to do with the guardianship. At age 18 also seems to be related to Social Security benefits, people obtaining their Social Security after the age of 18. And who controls that?
One of the things that I hear a lot are that people are concerned because they've been told by someone that if their adult child with a disability may have to access either long-term services and supports through Medicaid or other programs, or Social Security benefits through SSI or SSDI, that they are required to have a guardianship first. And that's not true either, but it's one of those things that a lot of people are told or believe. And so that's once again a situation where information about alternatives to guardianship and supports and services that are available are really important.
And I think that, Jeff, just kind of to add to that, one of the things that you had mentioned to me is that Disability Rights of Texas is doing quite a bit of training across the state with the local authorities on both for mental health as well as intellectual developmental disabilities. And so, so our direct support, or is that primarily direct case management or direct support?
It is.
Or?
At this point, it's primarily case management folks that we've been training.
Okay. Well, and I think that's probably a good thing to know, and especially if it's something that is local in the area, that if you're providing training to a local authority that people might want to tag on to.
Absolutely.
So, okay. I think that's about it. That's about the questions we have. I do have one other comment that had to be with a much earlier slide that we were talking about a person's skills, abilities, preference, and capacities for employment when we go through the discovery process. And the comment was, don't forget their personal preferences, and that a person who's using or supporting another individual, that those preferences that they might have, that in their final selection is where that comes out, and that making that good job match. So I want to thank you very much for giving us a lot of good information to think about. We've come to the end of our 60 minutes. We want to remind all of our listeners that you're going to receive an evaluation of this training today, and when you receive that and return it to us, that's when we'll be able to put your credit up in your portal for your CU credits. Again, you'll be able to go to the UNT-WISE website and pick up this presentation on demand, and at any time. It'll take us about a week to put it up there, but if you have other people that this might be helpful for, you might be able to recommend that to them. So Jeff, thank you so much for giving us your time today. We really do appreciate it, and we also look forward to hearing from you again in October. You're going to be presenting, giving us a couple of ethics classes on supported decision making, which will include, of course, self-determination and an informed choice. And those ethics credits will be on the October 19th and the 26th. So thank you again for your time, and thanks for working for Disability Rights of Texas. Sounds like you guys do a lot of great work.
Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody. Y'all have a great day. Enjoy it.